I will always remember how I first met Sergeant Bill Swegan. It was 2002, and Neil Sullivan, an old-timer from Indianapolis, invited me to come down for the Indiana State Convention several days early. He wanted me to stay in his home and told me just mysteriously that he had somebody he wanted me to meet. I didn't know Neil, and I didn't know the man he wanted me to meet or why he wanted me to meet him. But for some reason, I just automatically said yes. To this day, I don't know why I asked no questions, but I just went. By the time that visit was over, I had agreed to help Bill Swegan write the story of his life and the way he developed his first alcoholism treatment program back in the 1940s and 50s. We initially titled the book On the Military Firing Line, but in the final version it was retitled as The Psychology of Alcoholism, because it talked about a whole lot more than just a military alcoholism treatment program. As part of this story, I should also say that I had been asked by Ernie Kurtz at about the same time to edit and publish Nancy Olson's book with a lot of help from our friends, which told the story of how the Hughes Act, the basis upon which the modern treatment center has been built, had been passed by the U.S. Congress in 1970. I was overwhelmed by the magnitude of the two tasks. Helped write two major books on the history of AA at the same time, but the way they were dropped down on me almost simultaneously, without advance warning, convinced me that this was God at work and I was not allowed to turn either task down. And I should mention that a third book was also linked in with Bill Swegan's and Nancy Olson's books. Sally and David Brown's biography of Mrs. Marty Mann, which had just come out a year earlier in 2001. Bill and Nancy, who had both been Marty's protégés, had both contributed memories and materials for the book on Marty. Bill Swegan's story began with a bang. On the morning of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, Bill Swegan, only 23 years old, but already a full-fledged alcoholic, was sleeping off a bender in the barracks at Hickam Army Air Base right next to the harbor area. He ran out of the barracks in his underwear as the bombs and bullets came raining down on the area he was in. All of his best drinking buddies were killed that morning. Bill continued serving in the Army Air Corps and the Pacific Theater until the end of the war. After peace came, he eventually re-enlisted and ended up stationed at Mitchel Air Force Base on Long Island, just a short distance from New York City. He was only 30 years old, but he was still drinking uncontrollably, and everyone could tell that he was going to drink himself to death. But on July 5th, 1948, he looked in the mirror when he got up in the morning and decided he could no longer stand to look at what he had become. He joined the little AA group not far from base and started working the steps seriously. He never drank again. He began getting a few other hard-drinking Air Force personnel to join him. They would all get into Sergeant Bill's car and drive off to the civilian AA meeting nearby. One of the civilians there was a man named Yev Gardner, who, unbeknown to Bill, was Mrs. Marty Mann's right-hand man. And one day, Yev asked Bill, "Would you like to work with military alcoholics full-time?" Marty Mann, who was probably the most important woman alcoholic in early AA, had founded the National Council on Alcoholism 4 years earlier, in 1944. And Marty had connections with a large number of the major authors and artists in both England and America, along with a number of American Army and Air Force generals. So there in 1948, Bill Swegan became the first person in the U.S. military to be officially assigned to work full-time in treating alcoholics on a U.S. military base, because they could not figure out anywhere else to include his position in the command structure. He was assigned to serve in the chaplain's office. This represented problems for Bill. Early AA had two wings that were sometimes deeply divided against one another. There were those who saw AA primarily as a religious program, Bible readings, lots of God language, and so on. And on the other side, those who saw AA primarily as a psychological program. We can see Sergeant Bill's position on that issue in the title that he put on the final edition of his book, The Psychology of Alcoholism. Bill told me on several occasions that he simply had never figured out what the word God referred to. He could not connect with anything that made sense to him. We have very little in the way of surviving literature from that non-theistic, psychologically oriented variety of early AA. We have a few short things written by Jim Burwell and Hank Parkhurst. We have a few relatively short but beautifully written pieces from Ken Merrill, who founded AA in South Bend, Indiana. So Sergeant Bill Swegan's book, The Psychology of Alcoholism, is the one place where we have a long, detailed account of what the psychological wing of early AA taught. Sergeant Bill does not just talk psychiatric theories in his book, though. He uses his own life story to show how traumatic loss, poverty, inadequate self-esteem, envy, self-pity, and rage can drive children and youths into isolationism, rebellion, self-sabotage, and ultimately the descent into uncontrollable alcoholism. But in his humanistic understanding of the 12-step program, Bill shows us how to make use of the healing power of the spirit of love and service to our fellow human beings to restore ourselves to new life. Mrs. Marty Mann, who continued to act as Sergeant Bill's patron, got the Air Force to send him to the Yale School of Alcohol Studies in 1949, where Bill studied with Dr. E.M. Jelinek, one of the greatest scholars in alcoholism studies at that time. Bill pulled a lot of his psychological theories about how to treat alcoholics from Dr. Jelinek. He also became lifelong friends that summer with Circe Whalen, who in 1949 began setting up very successful alcoholism treatment facilities in Texas. In 1953, we remember, Ebby Thatcher was brought to Texas and put under Circe's watchful eye, where he stayed sober for 8 years. The Air Force eventually lost interest in the alcoholism program at Mitchel Air Force Base and moved Bill on to another post, teaching ROTC at Kent State University, which is located in a suburb of Akron, Ohio. So while he was there, Sergeant Bill used the opportunity to visit Sister Ignatia at St. Thomas Hospital whenever he got the chance, so he could learn even more about alcoholism treatment from her. In 1953, Mrs. Marty Mann was finally able to successfully pull strings again with some Air Force generals, and Sergeant Bill was assigned to set up an alcoholism treatment program at Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas. Instead of being placed within the chaplain's office at Lackland, the Air Force gave Swegan the official title of psychiatric social worker. This worked a good deal better. As Bill put it wryly, your typical military alcoholic would be 100 times more willing to be regarded as insane rather than religious. Sergeant Bill teamed up there with Major Louis Jolyon West, MD, the chief of psychiatry at the base hospital, to put into practice all that he had learned from Jelinek and Sister Ignatia. In June 1956, Swegan and West published An Approach to Alcoholism in the Military Service in the American Journal of Psychiatry, where they documented the way they had achieved an impressive 50% success rate. Dr. West was one of the most important American psychiatrists of that period. He was later head of the Department of Psychiatry at UCLA and the man who discovered how the Chinese brainwashing of American prisoners of war during the Korean War actually worked. Someone trying to put together a really good study of early military alcoholism treatment programs would absolutely need to read some of his books and articles. The Lackland model, which Swegan and West developed, was one of the three classical early models of alcoholism treatment, along with the Minnesota model and Sister Ignatia's more spiritually oriented type of program. Some might prefer to call it the Lackland-Long Beach model, because during the 1960s, this type of treatment program, which combines extremely active AA involvement with good psychiatric oversight when advised, continued to undergo growth and development in the program devised for the U.S. Navy by Dr. Joseph J. Zuska and Commander Dick Jewell. It is just as workable today. If you want to get back to the 50%, 75% success rate of early AA, Sergeant Bill's book tells you one good way to do it.